Hello everyone and welcome back to the Biblical Bookworm. My name is Elizabeth and today's video is going to be a special one because I'll be talking about the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, and by that I don't mean the book, but I mean the actual spiritual exercises, which are also called the Ignatian Retreat. And I have structured this video in 10 questions, which I will link in the description as timestamps so that you can skip to the section that interests you most. And quick disclaimer, I have done the spiritual exercises twice so far, so I'm not the biggest expert. I was a teenager when I did the first ones, so that's going to be the experience we'll be talking here about. And I did them in Austria, so maybe you're watching from somewhere else and it's totally different where you live. And also I did my spiritual exercises with a society that offers traditional Latin Mass, so I have no idea what that looks like with Novus Ordo. The first question is, who was St. Ignatius of Loyola? He was born in 1491 in Spain into a noble family, and he actually wasn't a practicing Catholic, but a great sinner. And I've heard somewhere that there was none of the 10 Commandments he hadn't violated in some grave way. But and he was working as a soldier, but one day he got injured in battle and he wasn't able to serve his king anymore. And while he was lying on his bed, he was offered two books, the Gospel and a book about the life of the saints. And when he read those books, he realized that instead of serving his king, which wasn't possible anymore because he had an injured leg, he could serve God. And so he decided to become a saint. The first thing he did was a general confession, which took him 3 days, so you can imagine how many sins he has to confess. And then he had a really adventurous life, and if you're interested to find out more, I've linked in the description a really interesting movie about him, which shows you especially how he invented the spiritual exercises. He wrote those spiritual exercises between 1522 and 1524, and he also founded the religious order of the Jesuits in 1540. What are the spiritual exercises? The spiritual exercises are a retreat, and it's actually the first retreat that has ever existed. And maybe a short explanation what a retreat is. That's a period of time that you spend isolated from other people and other occupations to focus on God in prayer. And one of the main goals of the spiritual exercises in particular is to help you to learn to discern spirits, which means that you learn to distinguish what ideas come from God and what ideas come from the devil, and how the devil tries to influence you and how God tries to influence you, and you learn how to distinguish those and how they differ from each other. And in order to do that, you meditate on certain topics. And for example, as a preparation for general confession, you meditate on the Last Judgment, on the pains of hell, on the joys of heaven, or also on the moment where you will die, so that you can imagine what will be important for you when you know that you have like 2 minutes to live. And originally the spiritual exercises took a month, but nowadays you can make a shorter version which takes only a week. What do you do there? The spiritual exercises are divided into 4 topics, which are sin and God's mercy, the life of Jesus, the passion of Jesus, and the resurrection, and God's love. And first, you always hear a lecture from a priest where he, for example, reads a short chapter from the Bible or the Imitation of Christ and shares his thoughts on that, or tells you a related story to help you to meditate on them later. Because after this lecture, you have to go to your room and spend like half an hour meditating on what you have just heard. And you can always take a book with you to maybe get inspired what to meditate on. Or you can always use the book of St. Ignatius. This is the German version. And there he leads you through the meditating process and also gives you some tips how to meditate and what to meditate on. And usually you have at least 3 of those meditating sessions, and maybe you think now that that's a really long period of time and you're not sure if you're able to focus for that long. And in my experience, you have to sit through that pain, don't give up, and even if it's really boring and you think that you're absolutely unable to focus, in my experience, there comes a point where you get into the flow of meditating, and you might even overhear the bell that signals that the meditation is over. So just trust God with the process. And during the spiritual exercises, there are actually 2 main stations, which are of course voluntary. No one forces you to do anything. But the first one is a general confession, which means that you confess all the sins you have committed so far in your life. And the other one is the discernment of something. For example, younger people tend to use this time to discern their vocation, or you could discern whether you should do a major investment, etc. What are the rules for the spiritual exercises? Is there something that is maybe forbidden? Yes, there are rules for the spiritual exercises, but you're never forced to follow them. They're just highly suggested because their purpose is to help you to focus and not be distracted. So the first thing is you're not allowed to talk to other people, and you're also advised to avoid looking in the eyes of other people to avoid nonverbal communication. And the only people you're allowed to talk to are priests. They have certain office hours where you can go and talk to them and ask for spiritual advice, or tell them that you're bothered by something and ask for help with that, or ask questions. And in my case, it always goes like that. I tend to talk a lot with myself. Like, as soon as I enter the room, I talk with myself because I fear that I might lose my speech out of lack of practice after the spiritual exercises. Anyways, another rule is you're obviously not allowed to use your phone, except maybe for setting an alarm clock if there is no other option available. And you're also not allowed to use the internet. And in my experience, at least where I did the spiritual exercises, there were separate exercises for women and men. Is it fun? No, but let me explain. During my first spiritual exercises, a priest told us that 2 things tend to happen to participants. Either you have really many temptations, or you have absolutely no temptations and are completely calm. In my case, both times, I had really many temptations, so that was really draining. But I've talked to a woman that has more experience doing those spiritual exercises, and she told me that it gets easier with time as you're done digging through your past faults. So there is hope that if you repeat the spiritual exercises, it might actually be easier. But you definitely can't view the spiritual exercises as a form of vacation, because even though you have the possibility to think about other stuff than the problems at home, you have a really tight schedule, and you maybe have the time to go for a walk or even for a run or take a nap, but you will have different problems to think about the spiritual exercises, so it's definitely not good for relaxation. And another thing is that you probably shouldn't do the spiritual exercises when you're emotionally drained, because that way they might get overwhelming. But the good news is that even if you end up being tired after the spiritual exercises, you will for sure have a lot of motivation to live out your faith and feel like a newborn baby. What can you expect from the spiritual exercises? As far as I know, Father Mike Schmitz says in some of his videos that he changed his life after he participated in spiritual exercises. He tells sometimes that he was a teenager, I think 15, when he did this retreat, and it completely changed his life. So that's a thing that can happen to you. But in other cases, like for example in my case, it might take a longer period of time, because I wanted to participate in my first spiritual exercises after watching a movie about Saint Ignatius, and I really was fascinated by him. He became my favorite saint, and so I signed up for this retreat. But the problem is that a few days in, I realized that this is harder than I thought, and I literally remember myself crying in my room that I can't be like St. Ignatius of Loyola and that I have to give up and whatever. And it took me like a whole year longer to change my mind and just saying that both ways are possible. You can have an instant conversion or you can say like, nah, that's too hard for me. However, you will most likely understand God's will for you better, and you will understand what you would theoretically have to do to become a saint, even if you decline the offer at first. Will you figure out your vocation? Talking about God's will, a main goal of the spiritual exercises can be to figure out what God's will for you is, what your vocation is. And the most important thing, in my opinion, is to be actually willing to accept God's will, no matter what this will looks like. And so the most important thing is to change your attitude. And for those of you who are maybe also afraid of God's will and you're afraid that your vocation might be something you don't want to do, I have a really beautiful quote from St. Alphonsus, which he writes in his book Uniformity with God's Will. And I've memorized it because it's really beautiful. It goes like this. Beyond the possibility of a doubt, God works to effect our welfare infinitely better than we could ever hope to accomplish or desire it ourselves. This quote means that you should not be afraid of God's will and that He actually wants your happiness more than you want this happiness, and He knows better what will make you happy than you actually can imagine something make you happy. So don't be afraid of God's will, and maybe it will take some time for you to figure out your vocation, but the Ignatian retreat will definitely help you discover your strengths and weaknesses, mostly your weaknesses, and this might show your vocation. Why should you do this retreat? First of all, to better understand God's will for you, and second, to improve or deepen your relationship with Him, because you get the chance to spend a whole week with Him in prayer and are not allowed to talk to anyone else except for priests and maybe yourself. And maybe some of you think now that the spiritual exercises won't help you in any way because you have already chosen your vocation, but that's not true, because even within your vocation you still have to make decisions, and maybe you have to review whether things went wrong, whether you did something wrong, and what you can improve to fulfill God's will better in your vocation. And maybe you're sure that you're on your way to heaven and you're sure that you will get saved, but that's not necessarily true, because even if you're a practicing Catholic and you go to Mass every Sunday, there are still bad Catholics, even practicing Catholics. And for example, Saint Bernadette, when she was asked what she's afraid of, she said the only thing she fears are bad Catholics. Just saying. What age should you do the spiritual exercises? At the place where I participated, I know that the youngest girl to ever do them was 16, and the youngest guy who ever participated was 14 years old. So your age really shouldn't be a problem. Just ask your parents, your confessor, or a spiritual director if you have one. And of course, there is no upper limit. I know a woman that was in her mid-90s when she participated. Should you, in particular, do the spiritual exercises? Yes! That's been it for today. I hope you liked this video. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, comment, share with someone that maybe needs this video, and see you next week. God bless. Bye!